Hello, I'm Chris Flisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion on astrology, art, and adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore the current planetary alignments and offer insights for coping with change. Educational, informative, enlightening, the Turning of the Wheel is a welcome pause in your daily swirl of constant change. Through intelligent discourse, inspired guests, and educational segments, I will help to enlighten your knowledge of astrology and guide you to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Call in with your questions and speak with some of the greatest visionaries in the time-tested practice of astrology. Turning of the Wheel, Astrology, Art, and Adventure with Chris Flisher, each week on Turning of the Wheel podcast. Go. Hello and welcome to Turning the Wheel. My name is Chris Flisher. This is a show about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. I've got my old friend Tad Mann waiting in the wings to come on. But before we get started, I want to remind you about my newsletter, which goes out every Sunday afternoon. In there, you'll find a couple of paragraphs of mundane astrology as it applies to all of us and the planets that are in line that week. And then beyond that, I go into the individual signs. I also include links to my podcast, my podcast archives, and my television series, which is all posted there as well. I'll have links there. And believe it or not, there's a donate button on that same newsletter, which allows you to donate to keep my to keep the great wheel here turning, which is the no shy, beg for money. But that's what it is all about anyway. So that's what we're talking about there. Anyway, my guest today is Tad Mann. He's been on many times. He's an architect, an author, an astrologer, an artist, many different things. A lot of words which begin with A, artist, astrologer, author, and there's a few other ones in there I suppose we could throw up, but we're not going to. And we're going to be talking today about an Ancestral Healing Summit, which he's been a part of, bringing in sort of the astrological edge and leg to that whole process of what ancestral healing is about. So what can you tell us about ancestral healing, Tad, and welcome to the show, too.
Thanks, Chris. No, it was an interesting proposal in a way to participate in this, and I couldn't really resist.
Yeah.
Even though it's an audience of which I'm not really very familiar, because a lot of people, also involved in the same kind of series are doing things like soul retrieval, whatever that is, and it seems like there's a kind of new agey psychic vibe to the whole thing. So,
right.
So I the proposal I actually made was to really talk about the astrology of ancestral healing. Mm-hmm. Meaning that I think my way of lifetime astrology, really more than a lot of other types of astrology, actually do postulate from the very beginning that our parents have a gigantic influence on our lives. And again, because the basic foundation, for those of you who haven't really heard me on Chris's program before, Chris, as you know, one of the foundation elements of my way of looking at astrology is that the sun doesn't just sit in space with planets moving around it, which is kind of the model most people have in mind, but rather our sun's moving 1 million miles a day around the galactic center. And so the planets create nested spirals that when you look at them over time, it actually looks very similar in form to the DNA molecule, especially when you look at it from an Earth-centered point of view. Because as you know out there that, to us, even though we're revolving around the sun, we look at the sun from where we live and it looks like it's revolving around us. So,
right.
So if you actually drew it as a geocentric diagram with the Earth at the center, it would make a double nested helix, which looks exactly like the DNA molecule. So my postulate of all of my astrology work for the last 50 years is that there's a kind of resonance, almost like a resonance connection, like a radio channel, a radio station, that basically is picking up on the energy coming from the spiraling solar system and resonating through every cell in your body. And so the postulate is that when your mother and father come together to conceive you at conception, you're actually linking your father's DNA, which is the traditional form of DNA, through your father's generation, and you're also carrying the matrilineal DNA that comes through your mother's family. Mm-hmm. And sort of these two sets of DNA entwine each other and basically we become a kind of combination of our male line and the female line, because obviously we have ancestors on both sides. And the point being basically that, of course, your mother and father are essentially the first link to your ancestors.
Right, right.
So when you look at the sun in the chart, not only, in traditional astrology, when you look at the sun in the chart, it represents, your identity.
Mm-hmm.
It's very patriarchal. It refers to your father typically, and things like that. But it also represents your linkage to your father's line genetically.
Right.
So you inherit qualities that may come from your grandfather. It may resonate with qualities from uncles or great uncles or great grandfathers, going way back through time. And similarly, the moon in the chart represents not only your emotions and the way you feel and your link to your mother, but it also represents that matrilineal DNA.
Yeah.
In fact, just one more thing. Just recently, about 2 years ago, I actually signed up for something called Living DNA, and I gave them a DNA sample, and they analyzed it and sent me an incredibly elaborate report. And they apparently just upgraded their whole program, and so were able to send me even more information that's more and more specific. But it's like they've taken my male and female lineages back 5,000 or 6,000 years.
Wow.
To the extent that I begin, and this is very relevant, I think, to one's ancestors, that not only is it guesswork like it is for a psychic to do this, but rather it's actually showing you where you came from. In fact, apparently on my father's side of the family, I come from a lot of sheep and goat herders in central Caucasus, in Central Asia,
right,
that basically were the people that brought the modern European languages into Europe. And of course, because they were goat and sheep farmers, they have a very unusual gene which I inherit, which is lactose tolerance.
Interesting.
You've heard about people that are lactose intolerant. I've always been able to digest cheese and milk and whatever.
Mm-hmm. And that's, you think, that's derived from that part of your lineage? You think that came through the line process?
Yeah, it says in the report that that's a prominent health aspect of my genetic lineage. So depending, everyone comes out of Africa.
Right, exactly.
But of course, we take different routes to get to wherever we end up, basically. So,
right.
And I'm definitely European. I think on my mother's side of the family, I'm like, my genetic heritage is like 95%, British Isles and Northern Europe, including Norway, Scandinavia, a little bit of French, a little bit of Spanish, and so on.
So it would be the mother and the father that would have the most direct linkage to where your sort of your direct lineage would be the most predominant there. You can go back further, but we all will go back to Cro-Magnon man eventually, I suppose. But
absolutely, that's right. Well, yeah. It tells you the exact amount of DNA, Neanderthal DNA that I have, which is a fair amount, apparently. It's so funny, I postulated that in a book I wrote in 1984 or 1986, The Divine Plot, about reincarnation in astrology. And, it turns out that I was absolutely right about that. Back at the time, that was considered an outrageous hypothesis.
But the idea of reincarnation?
No, the idea of us having Neanderthal DNA.
Oh, well, it would make sense because we're just a composite. We're just an evolutionary composite of what went before us. We just keep on adding to it, and we add new layers. And I think that makes perfect sense. It explains why people are more intelligent, living longer, because we've got a more accumulated knowledge and information that allows us to stay alive longer. I think that's a large part of it.
Right, and so the thing I did for the Shift Network that you can listen to if you look up online, shift.com, I think, or shiftnetwork.com, and the Ancestral Healing Summit, they're free talks you can listen to. But what I did was I basically said that, or postulated that, something I always have, is that where would you look for your ancestors in your chart if it were not through the mother's line and the father's line? And of course, Saturn traditionally represents, even in traditional astrology, it represents one's heredity. Mm-hmm. And it particularly, to me, seems to lean towards, your father's side of the family and, your grandfather and uncles and all that stuff.
Right.
But I think that in my system, which lifetime astrology is quite unique because I include conception at the beginning of the ninth house,
Right.
like 1 o'clock on the clock face,
Mm-hmm.
going all the way around to the ascendant at 9 o'clock on the clock face. That period of gestation, the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th houses, basically we go through the entire evolutionary process from conception to birth. So the idea is that if you have planets in those houses, they represent markers in history in a reincarnational level.
Interesting.
And I really think that there's a combination between our two genetic lineages as well as our reincarnation connection. Like, I don't know about you, Chris, but I know that I come from generation on top of generation of ministers. And I'm basically a complete heretic, being an astrologer.
Well, you could. Yeah, I know. I understand. I mean, I get that. My father was a minister.
I mean?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, my father was a minister, so I understand that. But I also think that the idea of ministering, being a minister, administering to people, is a skill that an astrologer also possesses, because you are there to guide and counsel people.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree completely. Yes.
Right. So
anyway, it's just it's fascinating to me because the postulate is this, that we assume, and in fact, many people who know quite a bit about science assume that we come into the world as an empty canvas. And I'm saying, because I go back to the time you're conceived, and each planet during the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th houses are not only things that happen to your mother, but they represent characteristics that can be psychological or even physical that come through your mother via the fact that from conception, when we're a fertilized ovum, and we go all the way to birth, it's essentially, gestation is like the collective unconscious of Jung. Mm-hmm. It's the previous history that we all carry.
Right.
And I believe that the planets in gestation are markers that place us on a reincarnational level throughout the historical process. And in practice, it actually seems to really work that way.
Yeah. It doesn't make sense to me that we wouldn't come to the world without inherent knowledge and intelligence. I think we do come preloaded, much the way you would get a computer with an operating system. I think there are certain characteristics that are baked into it, which we can see clearly evident by the chart.
Well, sure. I actually went through this process in the book that I wrote back in the 80s, which is that before, DNA was discovered in the 50s and 60s, but the idea being that before DNA was discovered, no one realized that we had literally in every cell in our body a linkage to the past.
Right.
And my impression of current astrologers is that many of them don't even now, in the sense that they really see it as being some kind of funny phenomenon where you suddenly have all these qualities.
Oh,
but
gosh.
They don't really look at your biology at all.
Huh. That's kind of hard to believe.
You know what I'm talking about because you've been to many talks of mine and we've had many conversations. But it's like for me, a lot of traditional astrology looks a bit like a cookbook.
Well, it is. That's how it's presented. Yeah, it's how it's presented because of the combinations. It's just a mathematical permutation of whatever combination of planets and signs that you want to have. But to me, it seems very obvious that, you can pick up character traits that you have. You can see them directly reflected in what your mother or your father were. Other people have the same sort of things. We see these natural tendencies. And they're not just learned by observation. I didn't learn astrology by watching my father preach from the pulpit. I learned about it on my own because I was interested. But there's a certain intellectual curiosity that goes with that. My mother was a librarian, so the idea of books and literature and knowledge are prevalent in my life all my life. So those are things that I came into the world with those, I think, preloaded to some extent. It's just a matter of, tapping into them.
That's what I'm saying. But in traditional astrology, they don't really talk all that much about your mother and father in that light.
Yeah, no, I understand that.
Meaning what traits do you take on from them? The sun in the chart, is seen as being the masculine part of you, but it doesn't necessarily connect it to your father or your father's lineage. But I'm saying that I began to realize, taking on this whole idea of an ancestral healing summit, that actually almost everything I do is like a kind of of Ancestral Healing Summit.
Well, it is. You actually think
Meaning
about it.
that-
That's sort of the whole principle of astrology. You're sort of trying to define where you came
course
from,
it
and what made you, who you are. So it really is very much, it's probably the most predominant piece of the ancestral healing idea, because it's really very, very basic core.
Well, I think it is. And I'm also, what's funny, Chris, is that, there are 20 people in this linkage, and that I'm the only one who's an astrologer. It's like, I remember in the days when there were those events called the Prophets Conferences where they had no astrologers.
Huh. So these people are all psychics, and these people are psychics and sort of intuitive healers and stuff like that?
That's right. Yeah, that's what
but
they
the
are.
astrology is the really only one that's, in this case, that's really almost the only one that's really scientifically based, it seems like.
That's what I'm saying. I mean,
Right.
and that's what I think is special about it, and that's what I intend to do if and when I end up getting kind of picked on to actually do a series of programs on it, which I look forward to doing, because even just thinking about it in that light just has brought up a whole series of inspirations in me about how to go about it.
Yeah, no, it makes
not
perfect
only
sense, because
planet-
people would really like to enjoy, I think that people would enjoy understanding this, because the astrology chart really is a glimpse in time. It's a time slice of who you are when you arrive in the planet. So it's really directly tied to ancestry. I mean, I think it's fairly obvious, but I can see why it's
Yeah, but
different.
Chris, also you know this, that a lot of astrologers, they don't attribute a time sense to the chart itself.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning, if you had a chart done by a computer, it's the same chart whether you're doing it through the computer when you're 1 year old with a kid, or 10 years old, or 20 years old, or 50 years old. The chart's going to be the same interpretation.
Right.
But it can't be the same interpretation, because we change with our age.
Well, that's why the
we're
progressions are
continually-
so. That's why progressions are so important. Yeah.
That's right, and that's why in my system I attribute a time scale around the chart, so that as you move around the chart through the sequence of signs, you're actually also moving through your life. And it's, it's so funny. It makes me a little bit frustrated that people, particularly astrologers, haven't always caught on to this. But I think some of the younger ones actually are, which is very satisfying to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's why I think, referring to the progressions, we are, we're an entity that's born on our birthday, and then we evolve and move from there forward, and our planets sort of travel with us, and we morph into something different based on our influences and our life experiences and all those things. It makes perfect sense to me. So the idea of ancestral healing.
But I'm saying to look at a natal chart, to look at Saturn in your chart, it doesn't really say, in traditional astrology, no one can really say, well, when did you go through a phase of your life when a lot of Saturnine things happened? Because that's the way I look at it. I look at it when you go through Capricorn, for example, which we all go through a sequence of the signs in our lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
When you go through Capricorn and Aquarius, the two Saturnine signs, whether you've got planets there or not, in my experience, in fact, if that happens during childhood, you go through a period of time where you have, very rigid schooling, for example,
mm-hmm.
or one of your parents is depressed or whatever. So it's actually, what it's bringing up for me, the ancestral healing dynamic of it is, of course, we're trying to heal something that already happened.
Right, exactly. So it's always a backwards look. It's always going to be a backwards look.
So it's really a backwards look, and it's taking you back in time in your own life.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, your father's impact on you happened when you were, I'm speaking for you and me and everyone. I grew up without a father, but my stepfather's influence happened from when I was, a year and a half old.
Right,
it was
of course.
very early in my life.
And a strong influence at that. But I think speaking of Saturn, anybody, you could take anybody's chart and look at their evolution every 7 years, 7, 14, 21, 28. You'd see the influence of Saturn at those distinct times. There's no question about it. Everybody would see that.
Well, I understand that. That's why I use what I call sensitive points, which is the aspect points around the circle, meaning when, because I attribute a time scale to the whole process, when you go past the sun in your chart, the main influencer is likely to be your father.
Right.
And in the same way, when you go opposite it, halfway around your lifetime later, it's often rebellion against the father.
Mm-hmm.
And when you go past trine influences, it shows when you make up with your father.
Right, exactly. There's just moments of time where you sort of separate and come back. I think it's very natural cycle. But the lifetime astrology approach that you've had invented, has always struck me as being very logical, and it's sort of the rate of progress that we gain. So from from conception to gestation is roughly 9 month period, and in that time,
Yeah.
the rate of progress between the beginning of conception to just till to birth is enormous amount of progress that is matched by the next. From birth to 7 years, and then from 7 years
Right.
to 84, as I recall it, right?
Correct. It's a logarithmic scale. It's like 1, 10, 100, and 1,000, where each of those gaps are actually perceptually equal.
Right. But due to the rate of progress,
Meaning the time.
yeah.
Yeah, meaning, I mean, if you think about it, from conception to birth, we're repeating the entire evolutionary process of, tens of millions of years, compacted into 9 months, which is pretty crazy to think about. But I realize more and more. In fact, there's a fascinating quote, because I've been doing some work on epigenetics recently, which
Right.
is that, the gist of it fits into this conversation very nicely. That the idea, when they first developed genetics, they felt that the genes said, "This is who you are. This is, Chris, this is who you are because of your genes, and you can't really change it." But it now turns out, they discovered relatively quickly, although they didn't acknowledge it until relatively recently. But the idea is that we're continually changing our genes, and not necessarily the genes themselves, which don't change, but rather the term in epigenetics is the way genes manifest themselves in us. The gene expression is something that is affected by, what we read and our spirituality and whether we meditate or not. And so there are a whole range of things that actually are continually changing. And I suddenly realized that my lifetime astrology really kind of incorporated that idea from the very beginning, meaning that I was saying, okay, this is your genetic pattern you're taking on from mother and father. But of course, we're making steps throughout our entire life that often distances us dramatically from our parents.
Right.
And separate us in a funny way from our siblings and parents and so on. Although we, of course, still retain that linkage. And I think a lot of the archaic healing, as they call it in this conference thing, is something that's a very important topic, because it really is about, the deeply embedded patterns that we pick up before we're even aware of who we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I get I get that, and then with the idea of the healing, what is the process? When they're talking about healing? Are they trying to heal? Is the idea of ancestral healing sort of going back beyond your time frame and to past generations and seeing where the strain comes through that can be, redirected? Is that how the healing approach works?
Well, I think, of course, I have my unusual views about many of these things, simply because I've had to,
Right.
to try to explain certain things. But the wide range of people that are actually giving talks on all of this, you'd really be shocked and surprised at how many different ways people actually do approach, like shamanism is an example. Mm-hmm. Because I think that a lot of the realizations I had in my life came about through interactions with drugs, for one thing, but also through, interactions with the environment and kind of shamanistic episodes.
Right.
It could be drumming, it could be being in nature, it can be being in strange countries like India and Asia and everything like that. But also I believe that we are continually remaking ourselves in a funny way based around a whole set of experiences that in a way I think we can change our view of our past. And I describe that as being related kind of really in a very significant way to the asteroid Chiron.
Interesting. Yeah, the wounded healer, sort of reviewing our past and trying to sort of make amends with it and have come to peace with it.
Right, and the way I'm beginning to look at it, and together with my Australian astrologer friend, that Linda Hill, that we came to a similar conclusion around the same time quite a few years ago, which is that an issue that arises with Chiron is that if you assume that we all carry a wound, that can be,
Mm-hmm.
it can be abusive. It can just be, a parent not connecting to us. Or
Right.
it can be life events or whatever. We began realizing and agreed, both of us, that a lot of the clients I saw when I was living in England years ago, wanted in a way to express their woundedness in all kinds of ways. And in a sense, I realized that especially women more so than men, but men also, that a lot of women actually began carrying their woundedness as something that defined who they were.
Okay, so their
Meaning
story, yeah, the story, the victim story, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So their story. So the idea is that the more you tell the story about how you were victimized, the more of a victim you become.
Yeah, you become the story.
Yeah, so you become the story, and you're reasserting its power over you.
Mm-hmm.
So Linda and I began saying, well, why don't we reframe it so that instead of being the wounded healer, we make Chiron the storyteller of our woundedness.
Right.
Which means because it is actually, all of the things that happen to us are essentially stories. They're narratives.
Of course they are. Yeah.
So if you say that it's a story, then you can edit the story.
Of course. Yeah. I like that.
Then that means that instead of talking about that wound as being something that made you more and more vulnerable as you get older, what happens if you begin to realize, hey, that actually made me realize more about who I really am.
It actually makes you stronger. It makes you stronger.
It empowered me.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
I've been treating people like that when I do readings for them, meaning I'm trying to search for ways in which the Chiron episodes of their life were empowering rather than disillusioning or feeling like you were wounded and whatever.
Or disabling.
And it's just a matter of changing the perspective.
Yeah, it is, and it's really. But the thing is that you really want to learn from your past, and that's the challenge. And this is what the squares and the oppositions in astrology. They sort of are the challenges that are thrust upon you at birth are there to help you address these challenges, accept them, and move on. Use them. The assets then become liabilities in some way.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think there's, as there's also a huge movement going on around. Like Hellenistic astrology
right.
and so on.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's sort of
unbelievably fated.
Fated.
I think of it as being incredibly fated. That because you have this particular formula in your chart, that this is the way you're going to be. Period.
Oh, I see. No chance, no variation on a theme then.
It's very much like Vedic is also very similar in a way. It's like it's a kind of picture of your fate.
Mm-hmm. And you have no control over that.
You
right.
better get used to it because it's going to happen whether you want it to or not.
Right. Whereby, if you think of it in a much more logical stand, where you have the challenges that are inherent in the chart, you use those as stepping stones to get out of the mire of life, and you use them as strengthening assets rather than diminishing.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I know that's the way you think about it also, and that it's a very interesting dynamic because. Just because it really is something like, in fact, I came across a fantastic Joseph Campbell quote not too long ago. Excuse me. The dynamic of it being that, he said that when he was young, he actually spent quite a lot of time with, on the West Coast with a certain doctor who he respected quite a lot. And taught him many things about the connection between, the way he interpreted it between mythology and your body and the way it works. And one of the dynamics of it that's actually incredibly interesting, I think, is that he actually postulated that mythology is simply the organs of our body. In fact, the statement I have right here is that Campbell once stated that myth is a manifestation in symbolic images, in metaphorical images of the energies of the organs of the body. This organ wants this, that organ wants that. The brain is one of those organs.
I see, yeah. That does make sense. I mean, logically. It certainly does make sense.
Lying beneath even the unconscious, collective or personal, is the body and the constancy and urgency of its needs, which are the generators of myth and the guarantors, so to speak, of our identity and authority. And when I came across that, I thought, wow, that is terrific. That's an incredibly valuable idea.
And that's a story that gets retold in everybody's life. It gets retold again and again as generations move on. It keeps getting told. The same story gets told in a different time and place, obviously, because context changes.
That's right. That's partially why the Rodney Collin book, The Theory of Celestial Influence, kind of really blew me away at the time.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fantastic book.
The planets to the endocrine glands. Like he says that. Like for example, Mars is your adrenal gland, which is the fight and flight organ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes
perfect
sense.
Guess what happens when Mars is triggered by an aspect in your chart? Yeah, you're more likely to get angry.
Of course.
Or attract people who are angry with you.
Right, exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Or you become very sexual, or any one of the Mars dynamics.
Mm-hmm. Action oriented.
In the same way that a Venusian time is actually, like the glands that correspond to Venus and to Mercury are ones that actually, for example, the thyroid is related to Mercury and the parathyroid related to Venus. So when Venus hits, basically what happens is that, because the function of Venus is about the glands that actually integrate things. Mm-hmm. So when we get Venus triggered in our chart, it's actually triggering the integrated glands within us to function more fully.
Yeah.
So we feel like things are more beautiful and more attractive, and I think that's part of the reason why we make mandalas.
Yeah, no, of course, that makes perfect sense. There's something about that that's very visceral and healing in itself. We're talking today with Tad Mann. His website is atmann, atmann.net, atmann.net, man with two N's and .net, atmann.net, and he's a part of an Ancestral Healing Summit, which is put on by the Shift Network, and it's important to sort of seek this out because it's a collective of 20 people, healers, and Tad was the only astrologer, which I find to be unusual, in the group talking about ancestral healing. And that's going to be coming up, or has come up, or is available still. And we'll get into that more maybe in the second half. We're going to take a quick break here, and we'll come right back after the break, and we'll continue our discussion. So, okay, welcome back to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Flisher, and we're talking today with Tad Mann, an old friend of mine, an astrologer, artist, architect, and author, among other things. And his website is atmann, atmann.net, and he's part of an Ancestral Healing Summit, which has just been put on and produced by the Shift Network, which you can Google to find. And the thrust of the summit, Tad, was really so people were trying to find your approach and your placement in this summit makes, to me, perfect sense because I can see the whole logic of astrology working there. I'm curious as to what the other people are bringing to the table. Are they bringing sort of this, like you say, this sort of new age approach to working with your past lives? Or what was their approach that was so unique or different?
Well, I would characterize the whole difference as, very much like movements in astrology that really look at, they call astrology evolutionary.
Right.
Like evolutionary astrology is something where planets are attributed to particular characteristics that pass on from lifetime to lifetime. Mm-hmm. Which is a very, very similar dynamic. But I think the impression I got is that since almost no one else in this whole teaching situation really integrates astrology. Well, astrology is very specific about these things.
Yeah.
We have each planet in a particular place, and it's in a certain kind of relationship to the rest of the chart. You can actually see when it's likely to be stronger or weaker based on those positions. Mm-hmm. And in fact, that individuates you, basically.
Yes.
But a lot of the healers' work, to me, seem to be more psychically based. Like I don't know how someone who's a psychic can really see what my ancestry is like. I mean, they can look at me, and probably tell certain things from that. But the sense I get is that a number of them are psychotherapists, or have been doing what they call soul retrieval work, which I'm not sure exactly what that is. But, the idea being that people who have worked with this, and the impression I get is that for a lot of people, when they get involved in psychotherapeutic activity or really working on themselves, it ends up coming down to certain aspects of who you are that seem to come from the past and seem to be almost like governing principles.
Hmm. So they must be doing like sort of like past life regression sort of things, and sort of maybe
Yeah, yeah.
hypnotizing people to the point where they sort of recall their past lives. But much of that can be seen. There was a famous astrologer years ago named Jean Avery. Maybe you ran into her years ago.
I remember Jean. I knew Jean quite well.
Yeah, she's quite a character. And I did a past life regression with her, and she fused the idea of astrology and past life regressions together, and she did a lot of great work in that area. And sadly, she's not around any longer. But interesting character nonetheless. She's well worth looking into her information. And I got quite a bit of information that was very familiar about my past life from that sort of exercise. But I think much of it was derived from the astrology of my chart, to be honest.
Yeah, I think so too. I knew Jean as well, and she wrote a book, didn't she, at one point?
Yeah, she wrote several books. She wrote the Mask We Wear, which was about the ascendant, and she also wrote about past life regression as well, I think. Yeah, she wrote a couple books. She was an actress and a frustrated opera singer, I think, and or something along those lines, and came to New York and tried to make it on the big stage and didn't do well, and then eventually found her way with astrology.
Right. Well, I think, but as you and I know, I mean, it really, the difference is there are all kinds of ideas like the Gurdjieffian idea of the Enneagram.
Mm-hmm.
Is very interesting because it doesn't specifically connect it to you. Meaning to determine which numbers you have that are significant. Mm-hmm. Is something that really is a whole different kind of way of logic.
And is that based on the same thing? Is that based on birth date information as well, the Enneagram?
No, it's not. It's not based on anything.
Mm-hmm. So where do they derive their information?
Psychically.
I see. Okay.
They say that this is that each of the numbers has a particular, the number from 1 to 9 has a very particular significance. And they actually, they say, well, this is, your soul number is 3, mm-hmm. or whatever. Right. But I'm just saying there's no way to really particularize it.
Right. Well, theoretically, if we are born at a time, you have your birth chart, and you were born, your father never met your father never met you. It's curious to think, would you be the person you are today had your father lived?
I think about that often. I mean, it's so funny because my aunt, his sister, and his brother are both kind of, they were both really fundamentalist Christians and still are. And yet that whole idea to me is a kind of anathema in a funny way.
Right.
But what's interesting is when I asked my aunt, who's now in her, I'm in my late 70s, she's in her late 80s. When I say to her, you knew Alden, who was my father, but he died, when he was 25, and she was very young. She was, I think she was probably 10 years old or so when my father passed away in the war. Uh-huh. But so when I asked her, what was he like? What would he have been like today? Which, of course, is a big question. She said, I think he would have believed the same things I believe, which is he would have been a Fox News watching fundamentalist. If that had been the case, my life would have been profoundly different.
Right. Did you have his birth information, right? Do you have his birth? If you're on his chart,
sure.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you see any linkage between? Is he his linkage?
Well, he was kind of Cancer Gemini, meaning he was kind of, he went to military school when he was in college. He went to a university called Emory in Atlanta. It's quite a renowned university. Mm-hmm. But it was so funny because he apparently almost never read books, and my mother was a curious reader and went to Smith College and got her degree in chemistry.
Wow.
So the two of them were very, very different in all kinds of ways, although they obviously loved each other. Mm-hmm.
But you became the product of that union, and
sure.
And you have scientific threads that run through you that sort of bring that analytical, sort of statistical quality to you, as well as that sort of that other sort of driving force about the meaning of life that goes on with you. It's a perpetual question we have.
Absolutely. So I don't really know because he died so young that no one really knew what he would have become.
What he would have become. What do you think? Do you have any inkling on that, what he would have become? I mean,
well, I think he would possibly have been, that side of my family tends to be quite conservative, much more so than I am. But then in saying that, my stepfather was very conservative also.
Right. So his influence did not stop you?
His influence did not stop me from being what I am today.
Right.
And in the same way that your minister father didn't really change you particularly either in that way. Although we do things that echo our ancestors for sure.
Well, we do things that echo our ancestors, and I think if my father were alive today and I talked to him about this subject, I would say, look, we are approaching a human condition from with a different set of toolboxes.
Right.
You've got
Sure,
your Bible
sure.
and your whatever. I've got my astrology, and we both serve in a capacity of a counselor in that regard, which is
Yeah, of course.
it's the same.
Sure.
It's a similar personality trait and a propensity towards a certain kind of thinking and logic and curiosity. So that's
For sure,
yeah,
for sure.
it's bound.
I love my brothers and sisters, but none of them are really like me.
Mm-hmm.
Although
Are they stepbrothers or stepsisters?
yeah, I have four.
Okay, you have no other
So
biological.
we all have the same mother, but they have a different father than I do.
I see,
So,
but you have no biological siblings.
no,
Okay, interesting.
no.
Mm-hmm.
No, and it's just, it is obviously a very interesting point, because it's like I've been writing a memoir in recent years, and it's taken quite a long time, a lot longer than I anticipated. But the funny thing about it is that when I think, because I also kept diaries since the 60s, I mean, for really almost 60 years.
Yeah, that's the way to do it.
The funny thing about it is, I'm sure you'll resonate with this, that when I look back, there were certain stages of my life where I made what looked at the moment like ridiculously kind of unusual statements or unusual choices
Mm-hmm.
that I realized changed my life from that point on.
Wow.
Meaning that I can't go back and think, well, what were my other options? Because I took one option, and it changed the whole texture of my life, basically.
Well, those are the choices that we make. Yeah.
That's what I often feel like I'm helping people identify in their own chart, which is by doing the astrology the way I do it, of using this time scale. What happens is that the events that show up as corresponding to the natal planets are often those times when people make a choice that says, you're either taking that loop or that loop.
Right. And what is it that you tie that to? Is it tied to a Uranus sort of epiphany or some sort?
Well, they're different types of, each planet is a different type of
Right.
event.
No, of course, it's always a combination, a composite. Yeah.
Uranus is like a change of direction, a turning to a right angle or a left angle or something.
Right.
And, whereas something like a Venusian choice might be an aesthetic one. It's
Yep.
like if you're an artist, you're always making genetic choice. You're making aesthetic choices that change your life.
Mm-hmm.
And even things like when my daughter was conceived, it was just it was a really chaotic time in a funny way. I mean, her mother was married to someone else and had 3 other kids and so on and so on.
Yeah, that is
but then that's the way things happened in the late 60s and early 70s.
Oh, I know. I lived all too well. I remember it all too well. I may have a few out there myself somewhere.
You can't, it's like becoming a parent and all of that. I mean, you can't imagine what it would be like if that hadn't happened.
Well, there's no responsibility that is so large as that, given how that shifts a person's life and what it requires of you. I certainly grew up incredibly fast once I found out I had kids. I mean, it made a big difference.
Yeah, you have to.
Exactly.
You have to, and it's a very powerful dynamic, and I'm eternally grateful for that chance. I have to say, I think for me, it really, it affected my view of astrology profoundly.
Yeah, it does. I had the good fortune of having twins, so that I was able to, and they're only 6 minutes apart, I'm able to see them through a lens. And this kind of gets back to what you were speaking about earlier. In my observation of twins, I can see the characteristic of a certain personality trait is predominant in both of them. But how they manifest outwardly is dramatically different based on the context and experience of that individual child. Yeah. So they both may have a certain...
That's the epigenetic dynamic right there.
Yes. It's the choice. And that's where free will enters in. Free will versus fate, and they may have a certain characteristic which is there. Obviously, they're both Tauruses. They should have been Geminis because they were early. Being Tauruses, they have that strong Taurian flavor, and they espouse all the Taurian traits that you'd expect of them. But they manifest themselves in sometimes very different ways based on the context of what their experience has been like.
Well, that's why that's the term that they use, which is how genes express themselves.
Mm-hmm.
the genes are the same, but depending upon your environment and certain things that just catch your eye,
Exactly. Yeah.
They just modify the way that same exact gene, because they both have the same genes, presumably, that they're taking a very different path and a different approach. One of them could be a farmer and the other one could be an amazing musician or something.
Right, right. But they would still have that certain earth, like one of them is a chef, for example, which is perfect for a Taurus. You'd expect that to be. And the other one works with his hands and does hard work. So you'd see those are still very earth-like tendencies. And they've married similar wives in some ways. I mean, their wives have similar traits. So you can see some of these, but they are different. They're distinctly different. And I've always made a point of expressing their uniqueness and difference, because that's one of the challenges you have when you're raising twins is, oh gosh, we can't call one the other one's name, and you can't get them confused. You got to be very cognizant of that, and because
Sure.
it's a very
you don't want to dress them in matching suits. And
never did that. No, I never did that. That was the last thing I wanted to do with them. But it's just that's one of the dilemmas of that. But I think it's been an interesting laboratory for me to have this in my life. It's kind of ironic in a way to have this. This dynamic of these two people in my life I'm very close to, who are my offspring, and to see the differences in the way their lives have unfolded in the choices that they've made going forward. Yeah, yeah.
Of course, I mean, I think that's true in almost any family, but of course it's more obvious when they're twins.
Well, because you get a side-by-side comparison, exactly. Yeah, you certainly get that built-in instant sort of change of the way people are, and you can see the immediate visceral changes in their lives and how they progress forward. But the idea of this the Ancestral Healing Summit, it's interesting because it seems as if the people who are going to this, who are subscribing to this, are those who are in search of their ancestry and where they came from through the lens of sort of a wide array of sort of esoteric tools, so to speak, right? And different esoteric avenues into discovering their past. When a person, in your case, you've got the data. You can show the charts. You can actually show the numbers. You can see the degrees, the angles, and you can explain it all very clearly to a groom, and then people can then take that knowledge and go forward with it. And that's great, interesting knowledge, life-changing knowledge. But then when you're talking about someone who's a psychic or is doing past life regressions, you can't touch base on the same level with a crowd of people in that regard.
No, you can't, and that's what's curious. The funniest thing is that, after my event, I think it was the interview, 45-minute interview with a woman who works with the Shift Network, who interviews everyone. That basically, what I did was I did her chart, and we talked about it a bit. And of the people that listened to it, and I don't have any idea to know, how many people, maybe hundreds, that actually listened to that interview. I got three very powerful letters. And each of these three women, all three are women, and the woman who interviewed me was, obviously. But all three of them said the chart that you interpreted of your questioner is brought up similar issues to the ones that I'm dealing with in my chart.
Oh, interesting.
Which is fascinating, meaning that, with someone quite a bit younger than me, I think it's a young woman who's probably in her late 30s or something like that, whereas I'm in my late 70s. But the idea was that obviously it was a woman who has some kind of very deep resonance with three other people who were listening to that program.
Were they of the same generation? Was it a generational connection?
I don't know, because one of them did actually send me her chart, and wanted a reading. In fact, all three of them were interested in coming to have readings, but only one of them gave me the birth info in an email when she contacted me. Right.
I'm wondering if there was an outer planet connection, perhaps, a Pluto, Uranus, Neptune thing.
Well, it could be. I haven't really had a chance to check that out yet, but all I know is that, it is. I just found it very curious that, of course, someone actually resonated with the chart that I used randomly as an example, and I think what happened is that she kind of liked the inferences that I made based on where the planets were in her life.
Okay.
As we talked about her childhood, she had some, a slightly afflicted childhood in a way, meaning in the first, second, third, and fourth houses, when you have planets like Pluto and Mars and so on, or Saturn and Uranus, that they create stages in life when things are likely to be complicated and confused.
Right, and restricted.
And if you're looking for healing, it often means that you're going to be looking back in your life to try to find those nexi somehow.
Yeah.
Meaning the nexus where the issues really began happening. One of them had a grand cross, and one of the legs of that grand cross is two sets of oppositions that are square to each other. For those of you out there, but at one of the ends of that four-sided shape was around 7 or 8 years old, and the impression I got was that, it was also, she mentioned in the email, just with very little detail, but she mentioned that it had something to do with evangelicals and about, very strange premises that she was seen in a very unusual way because she had a kind of back issue that was affecting her, and a very obvious one that affected her appearance.
Mm-hmm.
So it just struck me that seemed like something that would have been happening around 8 years old, where she had like a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. Uranus being unusual things happening that often require operations or maybe are triggered by accidents. Mm-hmm. Jupiter, because there's a whole religious and spiritual dynamic.
Right. And then, of course, with the that's a Saturn square, would be a square Saturn, 7, 8 years old.
Yes.
Would also bring the hardship and sort of the the onerous qualities to it, or the working through qualities to it.
Right. So even though it wasn't her chart, she said that it actually triggered something in her that she made her feel as though she was coming closer to finding an avenue through which to travel. Mm-hmm. I think, from what I know about psychotherapy, which is quite a lot, I suspect that a lot of these people have techniques that they've developed that they use to allow people to go deeper. As you know, astrology is funny in that way because it's not really a treatment system, although it can really change people.
Oh, of course. And you can get there very quickly. You could spend 6 months with a therapist and never get anywhere near as close as you can with an hour or two with an astrologer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And also because, and that's one of the points I made, which is that using astrology together with this idea of ancestral healing, you can look and see where tension points happen and date them.
That's the thing. That's the beauty. That's why I was saying it seems so logical for you to be there, and that wasn't quite as clear as the others because,
exactly,
trying to heal a person's past in a sort of a group setting is not ideal, I wouldn't think. Whereas the astrology,
no, it's not.
Yeah.
And also the fact that by identifying a particular time in your life, you can go, and maybe it's a Saturn influence happening at around that time. You think about what are Saturnine type people. I talked a bit about the personality types that correspond to the signs in your life. Like she may be thinking, oh my God, my grandfather lived with us when I was 7 years old. He was very cranky and so on. Could easily be a kind of connection to a trauma that happened around that time.
Right, and you would see that. That's what's important about the chart. You see that. It's not all charts are crisply clear, but most of them have have that ability to find that stuff.
That's right, but my way of doing it is there's a big difference between something happening in gestation that is a very deeply embedded influence, because it means it's something that happened to your mother while she was carrying you.
Right. So an event like that would carry far more weight than something that happened in the schoolyard when you were 7 or 8 years old, perhaps.
That's right, because you can remember what that was and and kind of describe it in a very clear way, whereas gestational influences are going to be much deeper. And by the way I describe it, that it's like they're buried in your physical body.
Right. Do you think
maybe you need to have hypnosis or something to really get at it?
Do you think had your father not died that you would be so interested in this sort of trying to discover your past? Because much of your life has been a quest to discover, fill in the missing pieces of a life that would have been had he lived. Do you think that had he lived, your quest would have been as ardent as it has been?
It's very hard to say. I don't really know.
Right, there's no way of proving. Yeah, it's just an idea.
I have a suspicion it would have, but also, I mean, my mother died when I was 16 also. So she was, actually, she was I was very close to her. And, I still find myself thinking, what would she have, and I think she was a very, very open-minded woman. She was very smart and very academic and was known for her big heart in a way. But the whole idea being that relatives of mine have said, I think your mother would have been proud of you.
Huh, interesting, yeah.
Which is kind of interesting that that they have a sensation that she could have been on the same page. And in fact, when my mother's mother died in the mid '80s, I was left a desk set that belonged to her, because I remember in childhood never really ever coming into contact with astrology or its ideas or terms. But what my grandmother left me was a desk set that's covered with astrological symbols.
Oh, wow. I mean,
It has, like a blotter.
Oh, yeah,
inside of a
right,
blotter and
yeah.
an ink
Right.
well. And they're actually unbelievably beautiful because, because they come from a very special kind of place. They're what is it called? Hold on a second.
Well, your fascination with architecture, I think, was a direct relationship to your then proceeding into astrology from there, because astrology is all geometry based, and so is architecture.
Absolutely, no, absolutely, and I do think that was, like a very fated kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a melding of ideas. It's a branching. It's sort of a broadening of the ideas when you take the architectural and you take that from the sort of the very foundational plane of what it means to have form and function and line and angle, and you translate that to this world of astrology in this huge circle. It's incredible revelation. I had the same sort of experience myself, which brought me to the same sort of arrival, maybe through different means, but the same destination was there for me.
Well, sure, yeah. The Mars and Taurus, trine Venus and Virgo is it sums up mandala painting as well as architecture.
It sure does. Yeah, right, it does, and they're closely related.
The people that made the desk set are. Do you remember the company that made those amazing glass shades of lampshades?
Oh, Tiffany.
Tiffany. It's a Tiffany desk set.
Oh, wow. Very nice.
It's covered with astrological symbols.
And it's glass.
No. It's not glass. It's made out of, I don't know, it's like a kind of, I don't know whether maybe it's a copper composite or something.
Wow, very
they're
nice.
Metal.
Yeah.
It's very, very beautiful.
So what do you think, why did you think that came into your family? How did that get into your family?
I don't have a clue, because I inherited it from my grandmother, and I was always sitting at her desk when I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think I ever asked her what that was.
Yeah, was she part of your life?
My grandmother was certainly not into astrology, as far as I know, but who knows?
Yeah, I know. Who knows is right. We don't know. Maybe she was a Rosicrucian secretly or something. Who knows? Well,
But I was talking to someone just the other day about that, because it's funny, and I don't know whether you feel the same way, but all I know is that when I first discovered astrology, when I was in my mid-20s or late 20s, it's like it felt to me like I wasn't learning something new, but just remembering something that I had in my system.
Yeah, like you almost came preloaded with the idea of this knowing about
It's almost like I was preloaded, and it needed some kind of trigger to kind of manifest itself.
Well, I will say that when I first got interested in astrology, for me it was a complete addiction right off the bat. I was so fascinated by the accuracy of it. I felt, and stuff came to me very naturally, very intuitively. Like I can understand this without even having an explanation for it, which always sort of startled me. Like, how do I know this works when I don't have any information to back it up? And then I'd go research it, and the answer would be there, would be satisfying to me, and I'd be like, wow, this is really.
Well, the funny thing is, I had a very interesting and very different response, which is I first had my chart created there was something in Grand Central Station in the 50s called Astroflash.
Oh.
I don't know if you remember that. It was a computer that was like the size of a car.
Yeah. And you put in your birth date information?
You put in your birth date, and it produced a kind of dot matrix printout.
Oh my gosh, it's funny.
And the point is, I was fascinated by, the chart was not a circle. It was just a list of house cusps and planets. But anyway, I immediately tried to actually draw a chart. The interpretation, it struck me as being complete rubbish.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that by making the image, I thought this looks really, really interesting, but I don't like the interpretation of it.
Right.
I think I probably still feel that way.
Yeah.
You know?
I know. Wish we could only change your chart.
Because that did not change my mind at all. In fact, it made me even more keen to kind of figure out how it really works.
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting pursuit. There's no question about it. Well, we've run out of time here. We've run out of time here, Tab, but I want to know a little more about the Shift Network, and if you could tell people what it's all about, just quickly summarize how they could find it.
Yeah, well, look it up as the Shift Network, and I think it's probably .com.
Mm-hmm.
And also you can search on Ancestral Healing Summit.
Okay.
And I know it's going on over the next couple of weeks, and I think that these free sessions are available whenever you tune in. You can probably listen to it through your computer or something. So
right.
If you look for Mann, because I'm one of the dozen people, and there's a page that has photographs of everyone who is involved in this. In fact, it's so weird because I haven't ever heard of any of the other people at all.
I have heard of several. I had Sandra Ingerman on my show probably 14 years ago, and I interviewed Mark Wolin. He wrote a book, something along the lines, "It's not your fault." In other words, you are the product of your ancestry. It's not your fault that you're the way you are. Words to that effect. And he was an interesting guy. I had him on a long time ago as well. Because I'm still in the same sort of pursuit as you are. I'm still trying to figure the whole thing out. So it's always a question of a nonstop search. But anyway, thanks so much for coming on today, Tad. It's been great speaking with you and catching up. Again,
you're welcome, Chris. It's always a pleasure.
Ancestral Healing Summit on the Shift Network, and Tad's website is atmann, ATMANN, double N's at the end there, .net. Make sure you get the .net in there. It's very important. atmann.net. Is Tad's website. He's got an amazing array of books, fantastic artwork, and he's been working on a number of projects, always been stimulating, always pushing the ball down the road further for all of us. So we certainly appreciate that. All right, very good. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah. You've been listening to Turning of the Wheel with your host, Chris Flisher. To schedule a reading with me or to order artwork, you may visit my website at www.turningofthewheel.com. That's www.turningofthewheel.com. Or you can call me at 978-393-1036. Thank you. And as always, be open to possibilities.